It started with a photograph, a single, sun-faded image tucked inside a cracked wooden frame, discovered in the attic of a farmhouse that hadn't been lived in since the Eisenhower years. The floorboards were warped, the windows clouded with mildew, and the whole place smelled like dust and rainwater that had nowhere else to go. The photograph itself looked older than it should have been. Its corners were curling inward, the paper stained with a brownish hue, and the protective glass had long since splintered. Whoever took it had used one of those early glass plate cameras, the kind that captured light in slow, aching seconds. But what unsettled everyone who saw it wasn't its age. It was the faces. Two young women standing barefoot in the moonlight, side by side outside a weathered cabin half swallowed by fog. Their dresses were plain, white cotton, torn near the hem. One of them, the taller of the two, had her hands clasped in front of her. The other had hers hidden behind her back. At first glance, they looked like sisters, but on closer inspection, they were identical. Their faces were slightly blurred, as if the camera lens couldn't quite decide where one ended and the other began. But their eyes looked painted over, clouded, artificial. The back of the photo had a date written in faded pencil, 1878, and beneath it, just 3 words, the Moore twins. But when a curator tried to research the names written on the back, she found something strange. There were no birth records for any Moore twins in the Pine Ridge area that year. No census entries, no church records, no marriage licenses, nothing. It was as if the 2 girls had never existed, except people in Pine Ridge still whispered about them, quietly, cautiously, like mentioning them too loud might call them back. Before we go any deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I want to know who's up with me tonight, because this story, it's not just another legend, it's a chapter of history Kentucky itself tried to erase. Every story in Appalachia begins with the land, and this one is no different. Pine Ridge sits on the far edge of the Cumberland Plateau, a stretch of high broken country that rises like an old scar across southern Kentucky. It's a place of caves, mist and silence, where the ground seems to breathe at night and where the sound of a single whippoorwill can carry for miles. In the late 1800s, families there lived hard and quiet. The Civil War had ended barely a decade earlier, but the wounds had. People didn't trust outsiders or each other. Church and superstition filled the gaps where law couldn't reach. And somewhere deep in those hills, not far from the Rockcastle River, there stood a cabin, gray wood, moss on the roof, a single crooked chimney. That was the Moore homestead. The mother, Martha Moore, had built it herself after her husband disappeared during the war. Some said he died in Tennessee. Others said he just never came back. She raised her twin daughters there alone, living off what little the soil and forest could give. The nearest neighbor was nearly 2 miles away. By 1878, the girls, June and Jessa, were 17. They'd never gone to school, never been baptized, rarely seen in town. When they did appear, usually to trade or fetch supplies, people remembered them for how quiet they were. They moved like mirror images, one always a step behind the other, their heads tilted the same way, their voices soft but perfectly in sync when they spoke. It wasn't just their resemblance that unsettled folks. It was how they seemed to watch everything, as if the world around them was slightly off balance, and they were the only ones who could see it. In those days, Pine Ridge was a place where stories spread faster than truth. Someone would claim they saw the twins wandering the riverbank at night, humming in perfect harmony. Someone else would swear they watched one of them slip into the woods alone, only to see both return an hour later, and every version changed a little with each retelling. But no matter who told it, every story ended the same way, with the twins standing under a full moon, watching something only they could see. The farmhouse where the photograph was found, that attic filled with the smell of rain and dust, once belonged to the Holcomb family, and according to an old property ledger, they bought the land from a Martha Moore in 18. That same year, local records note 3 unexplained disappearances in the Pine Ridge area: a farmhand, a traveling peddler, and a hunter. None were ever found. By 1879, the Moore's cabin was abandoned, the door left hanging open. Inside, 2 small dresses folded neatly on a bed, and a broken mirror on the floor. If you talk to the oldest residents of the county, the ones whose grandparents grew up hearing these stories, They'll tell you the same thing. The Moore twins weren't killers. They weren't witches. They were something in between. Something the mountain itself tried to warn people about. This photograph, this cracked, unsettling fragment of the past, is the only surviving image of them. Every other record, every letter, every scrap of paper connected to their family, burned, lost, or sealed away in archives that no one seems to have access to anymore. But sometimes, when researchers adjust the lighting on the scan, brightening the shadows and sharpening the edges, faint writing appears along the bottom border. It's barely visible, but it looks like someone's handwriting, scrawled in the same faded pencil that marked the back. 3 words, the same phrase found later carved into limestone deep beneath the Moors' land. 2 made 1. And by the time we reach the end of this story, you'll understand what it meant, and why the people of Pine Ridge still refuse to speak the Moors' names out loud. Because in 1878, under a wrong moon, something happened in those woods that changed everything. And though time has buried it beneath layers of fog and silence, some things in Kentucky never stay buried for long. By the end of this story, you'll understand why their names were erased from every record, except one. The Cumberland Plateau has always been a place apart, a stretch of earth that seems to exist halfway between the living and the forgotten. If you ever drive through that region today, you'll notice it. The way the mist clings to the trees even in daylight, how the ridgelines fold into one another like waves, and how the air feels older. Back in the late 1800s, before paved roads and power lines, the plateau was almost a world of its own. Families lived miles apart, separated by ravines and creeks so deep the sun vanished before noon. Sound carried strangely in that kind of terrain. A voice could echo for minutes, bouncing between the walls of the hollers, twisting until it didn't sound human anymore. People there lived by instinct and fear in equal measure. The nearest sheriff might be a day's ride away. The preacher was often the only man who could read. And as far as most folks were concerned, the land belonged to God, and whatever else came before him. The soil on that plateau is thin and full of limestone. Beneath it runs a labyrinth of caves, deep, cold tunnels carved by ancient rivers. Some stretch for miles, branching under hills, connecting hollows that were never meant to meet. Locals say those caves breathe. At night, if you listen close, you can hear them sighing under the weight of the world. That sound shaped more than the land, it shaped the people. When the wind howled through the cliffs, mountain folk didn't call it wind. They said it was the holler talk. And when the mist rolled in low and fast, blotting out the stars, they said the mountain was remembering something it didn't want to. That's what it meant to live there. You didn't fight the land. You learned to live with its mood. After the Civil War, the people of Pine Ridge had little left. The men who came home were missing limbs or minds, and the ones who didn't left behind widows who barely spoke. Money had no use. The only trade that mattered was trust, and even that was scarce. A man's worth was measured in how he faced hardship. A woman's in how she endured silence. And silence was everywhere. Children grew up without laughter. Churches preached as much fear as faith. There were Sundays when the preacher's voice would break mid-sermon, and he'd just stare at the floor, muttering that the devil's already in the valley, just waiting for us to forget he's there. That's how Pine Ridge survived, half in the light of the Lord, half in the shadow of its own folklore. Every hollow had its story. One had the crying tree, where a widow claimed she heard her husband's voice in the sap at night. Another had a well that never ran dry but was said to echo back the names of the dead. And then there was Moon Twin Hollow, a name that didn't appear on any map until years later. No one remembers who first spoke it, but the story spread like wildfire. People whispered that on some nights, when the moon rose low and red, 2 shapes could be seen standing together at the edge of the woods, pale as fog, watching, waiting. Some said they were spirits, bound to each other so tightly that not even death could part them. Others said they were omens, that seeing them meant someone nearby had lied about something terrible. They called them the Moonlit twins. Over time, it became a story parents told to keep children from wandering after dark. But those who lived through the 1870s, they'd seen the real girls, June and Jessa Moore, before the stories twisted their faces into legend. And even then, the whispers said the same thing. Those girls weren't right. They'd been born under a wrong moon. That phrase came from an old preacher's journal, the same one later found buried beneath the church floorboards in Pine Ridge. His handwriting was crooked, hurried, like a man trying to confess something before the dark caught up to him. He wrote, "The night the twins were born, the moon was split, half hidden, half full. The midwife said it was a sign of division, but Martha Moore said it was the Lord's way of giving double. I prayed over the girls, but I felt something cold in the room. Not evil, just wait. I have not slept easy since. Those girls were born under a wrong moon. So when livestock went missing, or a storm ruined the crops, the blame always found its way to something unseen. And if something unseen had a face, the town preferred it to be someone else's. For a while that meant the Moores, a family that kept to themselves, a family that didn't need the church, didn't need neighbors, didn't even seem to need daylight. When the twins were little, they'd sit by the river's edge, stacking stones into strange, careful towers. When they were older, they'd hum together, quiet and steady, like they were sharing a song no one else could hear. And sometimes, when one would wander into town alone, the townsfolk swore it felt like she wasn't, like someone else's eyes were always just behind hers. But to understand why those whispers stuck, why a whole community turned on two girls, you have to remember what kind of world Pine Ridge was. In 1878, fear ruled, God was distant, and anything that didn't fit the order of Sunday morning was seen as belonging to the devil by Sunday night. Even a pair of twins. To outsiders, the Cumberland Plateau looked like paradise, waterfalls, wildflowers, endless sky, but to the people living there, it was a living boundary. They said the plateau didn't just hold the land up, it held everything else down, the dead, the secret, the sins nobody wanted spoken. When you walked through those woods at night, you could feel it. The air would go still, the frogs would stop croaking, and even your own footsteps sounded distant. Some swore that was when the twins walked, when the mountain itself went quiet enough to hear them moving. That's where this story really belongs, not in the archives, not in museums, but in that thick, breathless air of a Kentucky hollow that never quite forgot what happened. And in the years to come, when things began to vanish, people, livestock, even a sheriff's sanity, folks didn't need proof to know where to look. Because in places like Pine Ridge, evil doesn't always arrive. Sometimes it's born there. And the next part of this story, the part about how the twins grew up and what they became, will show exactly how something innocent can turn into a legend too dark for history books. June and Jessa Moore were born in the spring of 1861, the same week Kentucky declared neutrality in a war that would tear the country and the Cumberland Plateau straight in half. Their mother, Martha Moore, lived a few miles outside Pine Ridge, on a narrow slope overlooking a fork of the Rockcastle River. The homestead her husband had built before the war still stood, a one-room cabin of rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, and a root cellar dug into the hillside. By the time the twins were 2, their father was gone. Some said he'd joined the Confederate Army. Others claimed he deserted and disappeared into Tennessee. Martha never spoke of it. She just kept working the soil, hauling water, and teaching her daughters how to survive without expecting help from anyone. People in Pine Ridge called her the widow on the hill, though no one ever proved she was one. She didn't go to church. She didn't trade in town. She lived off herbs, roots, and what the land would give. And she raised her daughters to do the same. The girls were strange from the beginning, not wicked, not wild, just different. Neighbors who passed by on the old road would sometimes see them sitting together on the split rail fence, their bare feet dangling, their dresses the same shade of faded white. They were inseparable. When one laughed, the other laughed. When one frowned, the other's face folded in the same way. They rarely spoke to strangers, but when they did it together, finishing each other's words like two halves of the same thought. More than one person said it felt like speaking to a single mind. By the time they were 6, the twins had developed a private language, soft, breathy sounds only they understood. Martha discouraged it at first, but soon stopped trying. She'd lost too much already. If her daughters found comfort in each other's words, she wasn't going to take that away. Sometimes she'd hear them whispering in the dark, long after the fire had gone out. The rhythm of it would rise and fall like a lullaby, a steady, murmuring hum that put her both at ease and on edge. When travelers camped near the ridge, they'd hear the same thing echoing faintly through the woods. 2 small voices weaving together, soft and haunting. One man later told a storekeeper in town, "Sounded like angels hum into the dirt." Animals went missing. First chickens, then a calf, then a neighbor's hound that wandered too close to the property. Each time, someone would find bones in the brush a few days later, clean, arranged in little piles, like someone had been studying them. The twins were never caught doing anything wrong, but they were always nearby. It wasn't just the animals. People said they saw lights on the hill at night, small flickers moving through the trees like lanterns being carried in circles. One man claimed he saw both girls standing on a flat rock above the river, hands raised toward the moon. When he called out, neither turned. They just kept humming, the sound faint but deliberate. By the time he reached the riverbank, they were gone. Still, for every unsettling story, there were others that painted the twins in a softer light. When a family down the road lost their youngest to fever, it was June who left a basket of herbs and roots on their porch. When an old woman fell on the path to town, it was Jessa who helped her up, whispering in that strange, gentle tone, until the woman stopped crying. They weren't cruel. They weren't even unfriendly. They were just separate, like they lived one step outside the world the rest of Pine Ridge inhabited. The Moors' isolation only deepened after the war. By the early 1870s, Martha rarely left the property. The few who spoke with her said she'd grown thin, pale, and nervous, always glancing at the woods when the wind picked up. She once told the preacher's wife that her daughters were closer than blood, that sometimes she'd wake in the night to find one of them sitting by the other's bed, wide awake, whispering something she couldn't understand. The next morning, both girls would act as if nothing had happened. Then there was the story told by Samuel Clay, a farmhand barely 12 at the time. He'd been out late one evening checking traps near the Moore property when he heard someone crying in the woods. It was a girl's voice, high, desperate, breaking between sighs. He followed it for nearly 100 yards until it led him to a clearing under a dead oak. There, in the pale moonlight, stood one of the Moore twins. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with tears. But what chilled him most was the way she cried without sound. Her mouth was open, her shoulders shaking, yet no voice came out. Then, from somewhere behind him, he heard the same sobbing again. He turned, and there she was, the other one. Both stood in the clearing now, facing him from opposite sides. He said he froze, unable to speak. The second twin took one step toward him, her eyes wide and wet, and whispered, "You shouldn't hear this." Samuel ran all the way home. He never set foot near that ridge again. When he told his father what happened, the man said it was just the wind playing tricks. But for the rest of his life, Samuel swore it wasn't. He said no wind ever looked back at you like that. By 1878, the twins were 17. Their mother was aging fast, her hands shaking from illness, her voice little more than a... The girls did everything for her, cooking, tending the garden, even hunting small game. But the older they grew, the more distant they seemed, not from their mother but from everyone else. They stopped going into town altogether, stopped speaking to neighbors. Even the smoke from their chimney grew thin, as though they'd begun living by moonlight alone. Those who passed their home on the ridge claimed the place felt wrong now, colder than the air around it, and on certain nights when the fog was thick, you could hear them humming again. Two voices, low and even, rising through the trees. Some said it was a song for their mother. Others said it wasn't meant for anyone living. Whatever it was, the people of Pine Ridge began to avoid that road entirely. Even the preacher stopped visit, because by then the town had already started whispering that the Moore twins were more than just strange girls living alone, that they were the reason small things kept vanishing, that they were waiting for something that would finally step out of the woods to meet them. Spring came late that year, cold and brittle, as if winter wasn't ready to let go. The trees along the ridge still stood bare when Elijah Rowe vanished. He was 21, a quiet, broad-shouldered farmhand who worked for the Holloways down by the river. Most evenings, after chores, he'd fish along the shallows before walking home through the woods that bordered the Moore property. It was a shortcut he'd taken 100 times before. On the night he disappeared, he left the Holloway farm just before dusk. The sun was slipping behind the pines, the air thick with mist rising off the water. He told Mrs. Holloway he'd be home before dark. He never made it. The next morning, his mother found his fishing pole propped against their fence, the hook still baited, the lines slack. But Elijah was gone. The men of Pine Ridge gathered quickly. By noon, a dozen of them were combing the woods, calling his name. They found his hat first, lying in the mud about a quarter-mile from the Moor's land. Not far from it were a set of footprints, small, narrow, and barefoot, leading toward the ridge. Someone muttered, "Those look like girls' feet." Another answered, "Or ghosts." The prints ended near a dry creek bed. After that, nothing. That evening, as the men prepared to resume the search, the Holloway boy came running from the edge of the woods, pale and breathless. He swore he'd seen something. Two figures standing at the tree line near the Moore homestead. They were wearing white, their hair unbound, faces still as stone. He said they didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching, as if waiting for someone to notice. When he blinked, they were gone. By the next morning, all of Pine Ridge was talking. Whispers in the general store, at the blacksmith's, even in church. Elijah Rowe, a good man, strong, sober, gone without a trace. And the last signs of him led straight to the Moore sisters. Miss Holloway said she'd always had a bad feeling about those girls. The preacher, Reverend Callum, urged everyone to keep calm. "The Lord's truth don't hide in gossip," he said from the pulpit that Sunday. But even he didn't go near the ridge anymore. When the men organized another search, Martha Moore refused to let them onto her land. She stood in her doorway, trembling but firm, her daughters behind her, one on each side, silent and wide-eyed. She told them she'd seen no one, heard nothing, that the tracks they found were probably her daughters from fetching water the day before. But the men didn't believe her. They noticed the girls' bare feet, caked with drying mud, and how they never looked directly at anyone, only at each other. Someone said they smelled river water on the air, even though they were half a mile from the creek. That night, a light was seen again in the woods, a faint, wandering glow near the same place Elijah's hat was found. Two young men went to check. They said it looked like a lantern swaying between the trees, though it moved too smoothly to be carried by a person. As they drew closer, they heard what sounded like humming, low, steady, two voices in unison. The light flickered once, twice, then vanished. The humming stopped, and the woods went so quiet. One of them swore he could hear his own pulse echoing. They didn't stay to look for more. The preacher called a meeting in the churchyard, urging patience. "The Lord's work reveals itself in time," he said. But his voice wavered, his hands shaking as he read from his Bible. That evening, his wife swore she saw one of the Moore girls watching from the edge of their property, standing in the barn loft, pale against the dark wood, her hair falling straight down her shoulder. The strange part was this. At that very same moment, another witness, a woman named Clara Bean, saw both sisters standing together outside their cabin, tending to a wash line. Two sightings, miles apart, at the same time. No one knew what to make of it. A few days later, Elijah's fishing line washed up along the riverbank. The hook was bent, the line cut clean. That should have been the end of it, the town declaring him drowned, lost to the current. But the whispers kept growing, twisting into something dark. A farmer's wife claimed she woke one night to see two shapes standing by her window, white dresses glowing faintly in the moonlight. When she blinked, they were gone, but muddy footprints led up to her porch and stopped there. A child swore she saw one of the twins walking barefoot through a field at dawn, humming softly, eyes half closed. When her father went to look, the grass where she'd walked was wet with dew, except for a single dry trail where her feet had passed. Reverend Callum tried to keep order, but even he began avoiding the subject of the sisters in his sermons. Instead, he preached about temptation, about deceit wearing a familiar face, and about things born of silence. Someone found a page from his journal later, torn from the back. "The twins were seen again tonight, by the river. The Lord forgive me, but I do not believe they walk in flesh anymore." The Holloways moved west a year later, saying the valley had gone sour. The ridge grew quiet again, except for the Moore's cabin, where smoke still rose some nights, and the faint hum of two voices drifted through the trees. But something in Pine Ridge had changed. Before Elijah's disappearance, the Moores had been strange girls. After it, they became something else, a name no one wanted to speak after sundown. That was the first fracture between the sisters and the town. the first step toward a silence that would last for generations. And as one old man would later tell it, that was the spring when the forest started listening back. By summer, Pine Ridge was sick with fear. It crept in slow, the way rot takes a beam of wood. Not in a day, but quietly, until one morning nothing felt steady anymore. Every whisper, every snapped twig in the woods seemed to circle back to the same place, the old Moore cabin on the ridge. The women at church started covering their mirrors. They said a reflection could be a door that if you weren't careful, something might step through. A few swore that when they brushed their hair at night, they saw two shapes behind them instead of one. Always blurred, always watching. Someone started the rumor that the twins' reflections could travel, that they followed people home through windows, or through the shiny water of a basin left out overnight. By midsummer, no one in Pine Ridge left a mirror uncovered after dark. The children turned the fear into a game. They dared each other to walk past the Moore property after sundown, whispering rhymes like spells. Moonlit twins, white and thin, come out and pull me in. None of them ever went further than the fence. One boy said he saw a shape moving inside the cabin, tall and pale, carrying a lantern that didn't flicker like a flame. The others laughed at him, but the next morning he woke with mud on his feet and no memory of how he'd gotten home. After that, the dare's Reverend Callum finally decided to visit the Moors himself. He rode up the ridge one afternoon, the sky heavy with the color of rain. The house was smaller than he remembered, the roof sagging, the boards gray as bone. Martha Moore met him at the door. She looked unwell, thin. Her skin had gone the color of wax, her hair loose and uncombed. He said later that her eyes didn't seem to recognize him at first. She let him in, and the smell of sickness and wood smoke filled the air. The twins were nowhere to be seen. He asked about them, said the town was worried, that folks were saying things. Martha's hands shook as she poured water into a tin cup. Her voice cracked when she spoke. They were born under a wrong moon, Reverend. It takes one and gives her back wrong. The preacher didn't understand what she meant. He tried to pray with her, but she began to hum softly, the same melody he'd heard once drifting through the trees months before. Her voice trembled and broke. He left before the storm hit, riding hard down the ridge with rain lashing his face. He never went back. A week later, 2 more men went missing. One was a hunter named Boyd Trammell. He'd gone out before sunrise to check his traps and never returned. The other was a traveling peddler, a stranger who'd been seen selling trinkets and ribbons at the general store just the day before. No one found their bodies, but one of Boyd's traps was discovered near the hollow, torn clean open, the iron twisted like soft wire. That was the breaking point. The town's fear turned hard, mean. One night, a group of men rode up to the Moore property carrying torches. They didn't go inside. They just hammered a cross into the fence and set it on fire. The smoke curled through the night air, black against the silver moon. The fire burned bright for nearly an hour, and from somewhere deep inside the woods, someone swore they heard laughter. 2 voices, low and distant, moving through the hollow. After that night, no one saw the twins again. No one heard their humming by the creek, or saw their pale dresses among the trees. The cabin's chimney went cold. Martha Moore was seen once, a week later, walking alone toward town with a bundle of cloth pressed to her chest. She stopped halfway down the road, turned around, and went back the way she came. Some said she was carrying food. Others said it was a baby, though no one ever proved she'd had another child. A few believed she was carrying something else entirely. For nearly a month, the ridge was silent. Then came the full moon, and with it, new whispers. A farmer's wife claimed she saw 2 figures walking through the hollow, just past midnight, one holding a lantern, the other carrying something heavy, wrapped in burlap. She said they didn't walk like people. Their steps made no sound on the leaves. The lantern's light was strange, too white, too steady. She said it looked like it floated. When she called out, they stopped. The taller one turned toward her, and though the woman couldn't see her face, she swore her eyes caught the moonlight wrong, as if they were reflecting something brighter than they should have been. The figures moved on, vanishing into the tree line. The next morning, dogs barked at nothing for miles around. The woods were filled with crows, And down by the creek, someone found a patch of earth freshly turned, the soil damp, pressed smooth, like something had been buried there in the night. When a few of the braver men went to dig, they stopped before the first shovelful, because, they said, the ground was warm to the touch. By the end of that summer, Pine Ridge had turned inward. People stopped traveling alone. No one went to the river after dark. The preacher's sermons grew shorter, his face older. He rarely left his house except to ring the bell on Sunday. The Holloway's old farm sat empty now. The woods behind it, where Elijah Rowe had vanished, grew thick with brambles, and if you stood there on a still night, you could sometimes hear it, faint and far away. Two voices, humming low and slow, drifting through the hollow like the wind. The kind of sound that makes you want to listen and makes you wish you had. By autumn of 1878, Pine Ridge was a town holding its breath. People still went to church, still worked their fields, still nodded politely to one another, but their eyes stayed low, their voices hushed. 3 disappearances, no bodies, and a silence that seemed to stretch over the valley like fog that refused to lift. That was when Sheriff Caleb Mercer decided to step in. He hadn't wanted the job. He was a veteran of the war left with a limp, a drinking habit, and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He'd seen what fear did to men in the dark, and he knew how fast it spread. But Pine Ridge was dying by rumor, and someone had to look the truth in the eye, even if no one liked what they saw. Mercer began by walking through town, talking to anyone willing to speak. He found that no 2 stories matched. Mrs. Holloway swore she'd seen the twins near the creek the night Elijah disappeared, pale as moonlight, their eyes shining like river glass. Old Silas Bean said one was smiling while the other wept blood down her chin. The trapper claimed he'd followed their voices into the trees, but found nothing, only a faint smell of smoke and the sound of dripping water beneath his feet. Every story bent a little more than the last. Every witness remembered less than they claimed. And yet Mercer noticed something that tied them all together. Pairs, 2 voices, 2 figures, 2 lights. Always 2. A window hung broken, its shards glittering dull in the dusk. The yard was choked with weeds. Mercer knocked, no answer. He pushed the door open, and the smell hit first. Dust, cold ash, something like dried herbs and river mud. Inside it looked like time had stopped months ago. The hearth was dark, no food or dishes anywhere. But in the center of the floor sat a circle of dolls, small, hand-carved from wood. There were 12 pairs of them, each twin carved slightly different. One smiling, one frowning. Some were missing eyes, others had black thread tied around their waists. He crouched down to look closer, and realized every pair faced inward, toward the center of the circle, where a single candle stub had melted down to nothing. That's when he noticed the wall, faint marks scratched into the boards, little half-moon shapes, drawn in pairs. He left without lighting a match. Back in town, Mercer met with Reverend Callum, who looked like a ghost himself these days. Thinner, his hands trembling. When Mercer mentioned the dolls, the preacher closed his eyes. Then he went to his desk and pulled out an envelope, worn and yellowed with oil from his fingers. He said it was the last letter he'd received from Martha Moore. He'd never shown it to anyone. The letter was written in a shaky hand. The ink had bled from moisture, but one line was still clear. June isn't the one I raised. Jessa says she came back wrong. The rest of the page trailed into broken sentences about a fever, a sound under the floorboards, and a plea for the Reverend not to come back up the ridge. Mercer folded the letter carefully. That night he ordered a search of the woods behind the Moore property. Before we go further, if you're still here, you're one of the few who can handle stories this dark. Let me know in the comments with the emoji. The search began at dawn. Mercer led 6 men along the creek, where the first set of strange footprints had been found months before. The fog hung thick, pale as milk, clinging to the branch. They found the remnants of old fires, bones from small animals, rabbits, birds, something with a longer spine no one wanted to name. Then one of the men called out. Hidden under a tangle of vines was a narrow opening in the limestone, a crack in the earth just wide enough for a man to slip through. They lit lanterns and went in. The air inside was damp and cold. The walls glistened. It wasn't deep, maybe 30 feet from end to end, but the floor was littered with wax stubs and blackened wicks. Someone had been there often. At the far wall, Mercer found a patch of smooth stone, where someone had scraped away the moss. Carved into it with something sharp and deliberate were 3 words. 2 made 1. The letters were uneven, deep, almost gouged. Beneath them a handful of bones had been arranged. Small, fragile, too clean. One of the men swore they were from a raccoon. Another said a child. No one stayed long enough to decide. Mercer sealed off the cavern the next morning. He told the men not to speak of what they'd seen. But in a town that lived on whispers, silence only made the story grow. By week's end, the words, 2 made 1 were being repeated everywhere, scratched into barn doors, carved into fence posts, whispered by children as they skipped stones into the creek. The preacher refused to hold service that Sunday. He said he could feel something moving in the air, like a prayer turned inside out. And up on the ridge, smoke rose again from the chimney of the Moore cabin. For the first time in months, no one saw who lit it. No one went close enough to ask. That was the week Pine Ridge stopped calling it a mystery. From then on, they called it what it was, a haunting. And the sheriff, the only man who tried to make sense of it, hadn't yet realized that by stepping into the hollow, he'd already become part of the story himself. The cave had been quiet for weeks. At least that's what Sheriff Caleb Mercer told himself. But quiet wasn't the same as empty. In early October, he returned to the site with 2 volunteers, Harlan Pike and Jonas Webb, men too proud to admit fear. They brought lanterns, ropes, and a single revolver between them. The morning fog was thick as wool. Their boots sank into damp moss as they followed the creek toward the limestone break. The air smelled like wet metal and decay. When they reached the narrow entrance, Mercer lit a torch. The light flickered, barely cutting the dark. He didn't say it aloud, but both men felt it. The cave didn't just wait. It listened. The first few feet were tight, a crawl that forced them to move sideways, breathing dust and cold air. Then the tunnel opened into a low chamber. Mercer raised the torch, its flame throwing orange light across the stone. That's when they saw the drawings. Crude, childlike carvings covered the walls. Thick lines scratched deep into the limestone. 2 figures, identical, stood beneath a hanging crescent moon. Around them were stick figures. Dozens, maybe hundreds, drawn smaller, like they were kneeling or bowing. At first it looked like a childish scrawl, but the longer they stared, the worse it felt. The lines weren't random. They were layered as if someone had traced the same symbols again and again, pressing deeper each time. Jonas said, "Kids couldn't have done that." Mercer didn't answer. Then it came, faint, distant, like air moving through a reed. 2 voices, soft, almost like humming. The sound drifted from somewhere far beyond the torchlight, a place the cavern seemed to open into but refused to show. Mercer's skin went cold. He raised his torch toward the flame beam, flickering sideways as if drawn towards something deeper. Then the sound stopped. Jonas muttered a prayer under his breath. Mercer told them to move on. The ground was scattered with wax stubs and the burnt remains of candles. In the corner, half buried in the silt, Mercer spotted something wrapped in burlap. It was a small box, hand-carved, tied shut with old twine. The wood was swollen from moisture. The knots stiff. When Mercer pried it open, the smell of dried herbs filled the air. Inside were pressed flowers, brittle and colorless, mixed with a handful of human teeth. At the bottom lay a torn square of cloth, white once, now brown with age. Stitched into the corner were the initials, E.R., Elijah Rowe. Jonas backed away, muttering that they should leave it there, seal the place up, tell no one. But Mercer couldn't look away. The teeth were all the same size. Not a child's, not an animal's, human. He closed the box carefully, rewrapped it in the burlap, and slipped it into his satchel. Then behind him, the whispering started again. This time closer. 2 voices just outside the ring of light. One higher, one lower, both murmuring in perfect unison. Syllables too soft to understand, too steady to be wind. Mercer swung the torch around, the flame crackling. The walls gleamed wet and empty. The voices stopped. A drop of water fell from the ceiling and landed on his hand. But it was warm. That was enough. Out, he said. His voice was calm, but his jaw was locked tight. Now, when they crawled back into daylight, all three men stood in the clearing, breathing hard, their faces pale. The morning fog had thickened into a silver haze that hung low over the ground. Mercer said nothing for a long time. Then he told them both they'd speak to no one. Not their wives, not the preacher, no one. He sealed the entrance that evening with stones and branches, marking it with a rough cross. Before he left, he dropped the burlap box into the lockbox at his office and turned the key twice. That night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of dripping water seemed to echo in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those drawings, the two figures under the moon, surrounded by hundreds of bowed ones. Near midnight, a noise broke through the stillness. Not loud, just a faint tapping on the glass. He sat up, looked toward the window, and froze. Two figures stood outside, side by side in the dark. Even through the pain, he could see their faces, pale, almost glowing in the moonlight. Neither moved, neither blinked, just watched. He reached for his revolver, but by the time he crossed the room, the window was empty. Only the curtains swayed slightly, though the air was still. At sunrise, he went straight to the office. The lockbox was open, the key still in the door, the burlap, the box, the flowers, the teeth, all gone. Inside lay only one thing, a strip of damp fabric, torn clean down the middle. The stitching along its edge read the same as before, ER, but beneath it, in faint brown letters, someone had added two more initials, JM June Moore. Mercer didn't speak of that morning to anyone, but he started carrying his revolver wherever he went. And that night, people on the far side of the ridge swore they saw two lights moving through the hollow, swaying slow and silent, like lanterns that never went out. One pale, one red. By the winter of 1879, Pine Ridge had stopped pretending things were normal. The missing men, the burnt cross, the whispers of singing in the woods. No one went near the Moore place anymore, except the preacher, and he was never the same after. Sheriff Mercer pieced together what happened from fragments, pages torn from Martha Moore's old journal, a few terrified witness statements, and the last words the preacher ever spoke before he left town for good. What he found wasn't witchcraft in the way people meant it. It was something far older. Martha's handwriting was weak and spidery. The girls speak of the moon as if it watches them. Jessa says June fell ill because her shadow wandered off. They say the moon can call it back if they let it through the mirrors. I told them to pray instead, but they only smile. June Moore's sickness began in the spring of 1877, weeks before Elijah Rowe disappeared. Neighbors recalled seeing her pale and trembling at church, her eyes rimmed in gray as though she hadn't slept in days. Then, without warning, she collapsed one night by the riverbank. Jessa carried her home alone, barefoot, her dress soaked with mud and blood. After that, June was never quite herself. She stopped speaking for days at a time, then woke in the night whispering to the wall, saying she could see her own other standing beside her bed. Jessa began tending to her obsessively, bringing her milk, herbs, and strange mixtures that smelled of burnt salt. The two were rarely apart, and when they were, June would scream until Jessa returned. Small circles of mirrors had been placed in the yard, catching the moonlight and reflecting it inward toward the house. Ada said the girls would stand between them, chanting softly, their shadows stretching longer than the moon should have made them. From the few surviving journal pages, Mercer uncovered something chilling, a kind of belief system, a twisted twin theology. It said, twins are born as one soul divided. The body cannot last if the other half fades. To make one whole again, the weaker must pass through the moon. What that meant, Mercer didn't know. Not until he read the last entry. Jessa says the light will take her tonight. June must hold the mirrors steady. She says it will hurt only for a moment, then we will both be free. Children claim they saw the Moore sisters walking the river path, hands clasped, their white gowns glowing faintly, though the moon that night was new, not full. A trapper swore he saw them knee-deep in the shallows, scattering ashes into the current, And every night after, the river seemed to shine faintly, even with no moon above it. Then came the preacher's visit. His name was Reverend Thomas Greer, a quiet man, known for visiting the sick after dark and bringing bread to widows. He went up the ridge one night just after dusk, carrying only a lantern and his worn leather Bible. He was gone for nearly 2 hours. When he came back, his lantern was broken and his hands were burned. He refused to speak of what he saw. All he ever said in front of a few stunned parishioners was this: they were not two anymore. The next morning, he packed his things and left town. Mercer later found what was left of that lantern in the woods. The glass warped as if melted from inside. A patch of ground nearby was scorched in a perfect circle, though there'd been no lightning that night, no fire. And in the center of the burn mark, pressed deep into the earth, were 2 bare footprints, both left. Death witness accounts grew strange. Some swore they saw only one girl now, but they couldn't agree on which. The others said the twins still walked together, though their faces looked identical. Not just similar, but exactly the same, down to every freckle, every line. Harlan Pike, one of Mercer's search volunteers, said he saw them standing by the old fence the night before they vanished. He claimed their eyes caught the moonlight in a way no humans could. Like glass, he said, like they'd been hollowed out and filled with reflection. That same week, the twins disappeared completely. Their mother's cabin stood cold, empty, the hearth unlit. In their shared bedroom, Mercer found only 2 things: a cracked mirror propped beneath the window, its surface streaked with dried salt, and on the wall above the bed, scratched deep into the boards, under the wrong moon, one remains. No one in Pine Ridge saw them again. The woods grew quiet, the river stopped glowing, and for a while life returned to its uneasy rhythm, as if the town had decided not to remember. But once a year, when the moon turned orange-red, hunters in the hollow swore they heard something moving between the trees. 2 sets of footsteps, falling in perfect time, and sometimes, if you listened close, you could hear a single voice whispering, "One made 2, 2 made 1, and 1 came back wrong." By autumn of 1879, Pine Ridge had gone still. The kind of stillness that only comes after something terrible. The kind you don't talk about, even when it's over. The woods around the Moore homestead grew thick with briar and fog. Crows stopped roosting there. Livestock refused to graze near the fence line. Even the stray dogs gave that stretch of road a wide berth. It was as if the earth itself was trying to cover its tracks. The Moore cabin stood a while longer, gray and hollow, its roof sagging, the windows boarded up with planks stripped from old furniture. Inside, Martha Moore, the twins' mother, lived alone. Neighbors said they saw her sitting on the porch some nights, still as a statue, her eyes fixed on the tray line as if waiting for her daughters to return. Sometimes the faint glint of a mirror could be seen in her lap. And then, one morning in late November, smoke rose from her chimney for the first time in weeks. But no one went to check. When they finally did, they found her in the kitchen chair, head bowed, a Bible open on her knees. No signs of struggle, no mark, just a cracked mirror propped on the table beside her, facing the window. After her death, the cabin was left to rot. Rain leaked through the roof. The floorboards warped. The cave behind the property, the one Mercer had sealed, collapsed during a spring thaw. Locals took that as a blessing. But when children played near the ridge that summer, they claimed to hear faint humming beneath the ground, like voices echoing from somewhere deeper than the earth. Their parents told them to hush. You didn't say the twins' names out loud anymore. Sheriff Caleb Mercer didn't last much longer himself. He wrote a single-page resignation letter in February of 1880, leaving it on his desk beside the rusted badge. The letter said only, "The Moore case has ended in places no man should follow." He left town before sunrise and was never seen in Pine Ridge again. Some said he went west. Others swore they saw him later, wandering the old rail line at night, talking to someone who wasn't there. But the hollow didn't stay quiet. Farmers began seeing lights in the woods again, soft, flickering orbs that moved, too slow to be lanterns, and too steady to be fireflies. At first, they called it swamp gas. Then they stopped calling it anything. One hunter, Amos Vance, told a story that made the rounds for years. He said he was tracking a wounded deer near the river when he came upon 2 girls standing in the shallows, facing one another, hands clasped. He said they looked like mirrors, each movement reflected perfectly by the other. He raised his lantern, and they vanished. Only the ripples in the water remained. Amos never hunted that ridge again. By 1881, the church elders decided to strike the Moors from the town records. Their names were removed from baptism rolls, property ledgers, even the cemetery map. Their graves, if there were any, went unmarked. It was as if June and Jessa Moore had never existed at all. No one spoke of them publicly again. But when the wind shifted just right through Pine Hollow, folks said you could still hear two voices humming, far off and faint, like a song with no words rising from the trees. A few decades later, a road crew widening the ridge path uncovered pieces of mirror glass buried deep in the soil, old, warped, the silvering gone black. The workers threw them aside, not knowing what they'd found. That night, every lantern in their camp blew out at once. They left by morning. In the years that followed, Pine Ridge changed. The church burned down in 1897. The last families moved away after the Great Flood of and by the 1930s, the old town had vanished from maps altogether, reclaimed by the forest. Only hunters and surveyors still wandered the plateau, and even they learned to steer clear of the hollow that never grew silent. Because sometimes on the coldest nights, when the moon hung low and pale, too big for its own sky, you could see what looked like two figures standing side by side at the edge of the tree line. Barefoot, still as stone, watch, and if you looked long enough you might realize only one of them cast a shadow. Time has a way of sanding down the edges of a story, softening it until only rumor and shadow remain. But in 1914, nearly 35 years after the Moore sisters vanished, Pine Ridge received a reminder that some histories don't fade. They wait, buried, listening, until someone finally digs in the wrong place. That spring, the old Pine Ridge Church, rebuilt twice after fires and storms, was undergoing a renovation. A new pastor had taken over, determined to modernize the aging building with electric wiring, new pews and a stone foundation. While tearing up the rotting floorboards near the pulpit, a worker's crowbar struck something solid beneath the planks. The sound echoed through the empty sanctuary, a hollow, almost metallic thud. At first they thought it was a buried box of tithes or old communion silver. But when they pulled it free, dust billowed up around it like smoke, and several workers stepped back. It was a handmade wooden chest, dark with age, bound with two rusted iron clasps. No one in town remembered it. No pastor had ever mentioned it. Someone asked if they should open it. The new pastor hesitated, but only for a moment. When the lid creaked apart, the air inside smelled like damp paper and old rain. Inside were a brittle, cracked photograph of two barefoot girls in the moonlight, the same infamous image that resurfaced a century later. A stack of 6 journals, leather-bound, the pages warped and yellow. A torn scrap of cloth stitched with faint initials, J.M., and on top lay a note in faded ink. Do not show this to the congregation. Seal them and seal the memory. It was signed Reverend Thomas Greer, dated March 1880, the preacher who fled town after visiting the Moore sisters in their final week. The pastor and workers brought the journals to the county clerk. Within days, historians were called. No one was prepared for what those journals held. Most entries were ordinary. Sermons, weather notes, counsel for troubled families. His handwriting early on was steady and neat. But toward the end, the lines twisted, letters slanted, the ink blotted by trembling hands. The first disturbing entry was dated 2 months before the twins disappeared. I saw June Moore by the riverbank at dusk. Her dress was wet. Her hair hung straight down like she'd stepped out of the water. I called her name, but she did not turn. When she finally did, her reflection in the water smiled before she did. Several pages after that, the writing became even more frantic. Another entry, written at an angle across the page, as if Greer couldn't keep his hand steady. Their voices echo where no echo lives. The mirrors in their home reflect nothing unless the moon is high. I fear they have woven something dark between them, something that draws breath in the hollow. The final full entry, written the night he fled Pine Ridge. I confronted them. They were not two anymore. No further explanation. Only that single sentence. The very last line found in the journals was written sideways, barely legible at the bottom of the inside cover. Two went into the hollow. One came out twice. People whispered again. Old fears resurfacing, old wounds reopening. For a few months, the journals were kept in the county archive, locked inside a glass display case. Historians from Lexington and Louisville visited to photograph and catalog them. They planned to publish their findings in an academic journal. But before they could, the box disappeared. One morning, the glass case was smashed. The journals, the photograph, the cloth scrap, all gone. Only a single torn page was left behind, drifting on the floor like a leaf. It bore the same phrase the sheriff once found carved in limestone. Two made one. No fingerprints, no tracks, no forced entry. The sheriff at the time insisted it must have been theft, some troublemaker playing into the local folklore. But older residents of Pine Ridge shook their heads. They said the box was never meant to be opened in the first place. Reverend Greer buried it under the pulpit for a reason, because he believed what he saw would outlive him. And in a way, it did. Before the archives were locked down, two historians managed to copy portions of the journals by hand. Those copies still exist, yellow and fragile, passed between researchers like contraband. Every version ends with the same last line, shaky and uneven, a dying confession that feels less like a warning and more like a sentence. And that line alone was enough to resurrect an entire legend, one the town thought it had buried in silence and soil. Because if the preacher was telling the truth, then neither June nor Jessa Moore ever fully returned. Something else did. By the 1930s, Pine Ridge was little more than a scatter of chimneys and stone foundations sinking into the soil. The railroad bypassed it years earlier. The post office closed. Only the name lingered on old maps, like a scar that never healed right. That's when the WPA came through. The Works Progress Administration, sent to document Kentucky's hidden geography during the Great Depression. They were surveyors, geologists, and young men with shovels charting the forgotten corners of the Cumberland Plateau. They didn't know what waited in those woods. In the morning of June 14, 1934, a four-man survey crew set out from the nearby town of Letcher's Gap. Their goal was simple: locate and document a collapsed cave system, rumored to exist near an overgrown ridge once called the Moore property. Locals warned them to stay clear. An old storekeeper told them, "That ground ain't settled. Things echo down there that don't belong to this side." They laughed it off. Science, they said, doesn't fear old ghost stories. But by dusk that day, the forest began to prove otherwise. The lead man, Walter Dempsey, later wrote in his field notes that the air turned thick and silver as the sun set, a fine mist creeping from the hollows, bending their lantern light. When they reached the old ravine, they found the cave entrance half sealed with stone and timber, as if someone had once tried to bury it for good. And yet, faint light flickered inside. Dempsey assumed it was phosphorescence or reflection. He ordered his men to break through the old board, but as the first plank came loose, a gust of air rushed out, warm, wet, and smelling of candle wax. Then they heard it, a soft humming. Two voices, in perfect harmony. Inside, the cave was dry and smooth, the walls etched with strange grooves. About 10 yards in, the men found drawings on the limestone, fresh ones. Not painted, but traced with candle soot. Two figures stood beneath a crescent moon. Their arms were joined. Around them, stick figures knelt or lay down, as if bowing. The Dempsey noted in his log that the soot was smudged and oily, as though touched only hours before, and yet there were no footprints in the dust, only two small impressions near the wall, both bare feet, both. The team collected samples, took photographs, and retreated as the air grew colder. When they emerged into the clearing, the sun had already set. The fog was rising fast, turning the treetops to shadows. That's when one of the younger men, Henry Talbot, barely 20, froze. He pointed toward the ridge. There, half-veiled in fog, stood two girls, side by side. They wore pale nightgowns, the fabric ghost-like in the moonlight. Their hair was long, dark, and identical, and though they stood perfectly still, both faces wore the same faint smile, serene, almost welcoming. Dempsey shouted, thinking they might be local children, but neither moved. He stepped forward. That's when Talbot whispered, "Sir, one of them don't have a shadow." Then they blinked. The figures were gone. The crew packed up in silence. That night, they camped 5 miles away. But sometime before dawn, Henry Talbot vanished. His tent was empty, boots still neatly beside the flap. Only his flashlight remained. Its beam pointed toward the tray line. They searched for 2 days, found nothing but a set of bare footprints leading back toward the cave. Both left. Walter Dempsey's official report was filed with the WPA office in Hazard, Kentucky. Later that month, it made no mention of the girls, or the singing, or the footprints, but in his personal journal, found years later among his papers, he wrote, "The drawings were new, the air alive. I think the stories were not stories at all. Something lingers there, not ghost, not flesh. A mirror that remembers." He never returned to Pine Ridge. The survey records labeled the site Cave N107A. More hollow, but locals gave it a different name, Moon Twin Hollow. The name stuck. Even now, hikers who wander too close say the air feels off, heavier, as if the trees are listening. Cameras glitch, compasses spin, and in the right fog just before dawn, people claim to see 2 faint silhouettes moving among the pines, their shapes overlapping, separating, then joining again, always in pairs, always barefoot. Sometimes, only one leaves footprint. There's a local saying now, carved into a wooden sign that leans at the start of the old ridge trail: "If you see one shadow, keep walking. If you see 2, don't look back." Present day. The story should have ended with the surveyors, with the records sealed and the hollow renamed. But some histories don't stay buried. In 2022, an old photograph appeared on an online auction site. A sepia print labeled "Only More Family." It was warped, cracked through the center, and stained like something left too long in damp soil. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. 2 young girls standing before a wooden cabin, hands clasped. Their faces were solemn, their eyes dark and fixed on the camera. Behind them, the trees of Pine Ridge faded into fog. Experts called it a fabrication, an amateur forgery, they said, a digital blend of multiple 19th century portraits. But locals from Letcher County disagree. They said that photograph had been found before, buried in a preacher's box beneath an old church floor, and that it always resurfaced when the hollow wanted to be remembered. What makes it stranger is this: when digital archivists scanned the image for restoration, they noticed something no one had seen before. In the lower right corner, faint writing began to emerge beneath the sepia wash, barely visible unless the exposure was raised. The words were uneven, written as if by a trembling hand. 2 made 1, and yet, under spectral light analysis, that writing appeared to be burned into the photo from inside the negative itself, like it wanted to be read. Most people scroll past it, assuming it's one of those creepy vintage hoaxes. But for those who've lived near Pine Ridge, there's a different kind of silence when they see it. They say the trees behind the girls don't look quite right, that the fog seems to move when you stare too long, and that if you listen, headphones on, volume high, you can hear something faint under the static. 2 voices, humming, perfectly in tune. The hollow doesn't appear on tourist maps, and the locals won't take you there. Not for money, not for curiosity. They say the earth there remembers, that some things were erased not to protect the innocent, but to protect the living. The photograph, the twins, the hollow that hums when the moon is low. Some stories don't end, they echo. And if you ever find yourself walking near the ridges of Kentucky and hear 2 voices in harmony, don't answer. Just keep walking. If you'd like more forgotten histories like this, stories the archives tried to bury, make sure you're subscribed and tell me which Appalachian legend you want next. Thanks for watching.